My guest today is Dr. Rod Havriluk. He is the president of Swimming Technology Research. He is a world-renowned biomechanist who specializes in swimming technique instruction and analysis. He's worked with thousands of swimmers and triathletes, including Olympians and world record holders. And in 2015, Swimming World magazine named Dr. Havriluk as one of the top 10 most influential people in the sport of swimming. He's spoken at numerous conferences across the globe, and he's conducted clinics with swimmers and coaches all over the world. It's a real pleasure to speak with you today, Dr. Havriluk. Thanks for being with me.
Well, it is a pleasure for me too. It's especially great when there's a forum to discuss shoulder injuries in swimming, because it is such a problem. There's so many swimmers that suffer from that.
Yeah, so I want to ask you more about why it's so common and what are some of the impacts that shoulder injuries have. But I'm curious, how did you become interested in swimming biomechanics?
Well, I suppose reading The Science of Swimming by Doc Counsilman was the first impetus for me to get involved in scientific aspects of swimming. I had been a swim coach before that, but reading Doc's book was a real eye-opener, finding out just how you could do a much better job evaluating technique and instructing technique based on science.
Yeah. And so I imagine technique is of the utmost importance in swimming. Maybe you can speak more to its role in swimming performance.
It is extremely important, and unfortunately, it's still underappreciated. For so many years, the emphasis was on training distance, and the more the better. And unfortunately, that some swimmers are still subjected to that, at least to some extent. Excessive training distance is still a factor. Now, there have been other systems developed whereby swimmers train with far less distance. And it's great to see that. But the conventional wisdom is more is better.
How did that, I guess, approach or mindset develop, that the more is better? Is that something that, how did that come about, I guess?
This goes back to the 60s, maybe even just before the 60s, where some success was found with a greater training distance. And then it just got to be, well, if this great of a training distance is good, a little bit more must be better. And it just kept increasing. So through the 70s, the training distance got excessive.
And what were the consequences, or what are the consequences of that excessive training volume or load?
Well, along with that, a lot of studies were conducted on shoulder injuries. And it was very common for swimmers to get shoulder injuries. In fact, it's so common because studies have been conducted over the past over 40 years now. And it hasn't gotten better. If someone swims all the way through college, there's about a 50-50 chance that they will have a shoulder injury. And a lot of times it's a career ender, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah. And so is your approach with coaches to try and modify their technique or to raise the awareness of its importance in preventing injury?
Well, a little bit of both. But yes, we have specific strategies that swimmers can use and coaches to modify the technique to lessen the stress that's put on the shoulder.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you can describe one or more of those strategies and how you might implement it with a swimmer or a coach.
Well, I think most people are familiar with freestyle crawl stroke.
Mm-hmm.
And typically when a swimmer puts their arm in the water, they put it level with the surface. In other words, parallel to the surface. Well, the space between the bone in the upper arm and the shoulder is decreased. And when that space is decreased, it compresses the soft tissue between those bones. And you do that 1,000,000 times per season, and that repetition can cause shoulder problems.
Mm-hmm.
So this gets back to where the excessive training distance is one factor. Muscular imbalances is another factor, but adjusting the technique is a third factor.
Mm-hmm. So are these the kinds of things that you would explain to athletes or coaches in an effort to maybe modify their training approach or their technique?
Yes,
mm-hmm.
It certainly is.
Okay. And so would education, I guess, play a big role in kind of the work that you're doing with athletes and coaches?
Well, yes, it does. I'm frequently speaking at conferences. I conduct clinics. I conduct swim camps. I've worked with national federations, with lots of swim clubs and individuals. I consult with individuals as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in each case, explaining the strategies that will help minimize shoulder stress, reduce the chances of an injury.
Yeah. Maybe you can describe some of those strategies, Rod.
Well, usually we'll work on the arm entry, since I just explained the typical arm entry for freestyle. Instead a swimmer has a downward angle with the arm on the entry, so that at the completion of the arm entry, the hand is below the shoulder instead of at the same level as the shoulder, then there's a greater space between the bone of the upper arm and the shoulder. Mm-hmm. That soft tissue does not get the same stress on every arm entry. Mm-hmm. And, in a typical workout, a swimmer can stress the shoulder many thousands of times. There's many thousands of arm entries. Mm-hmm. So an initial strategy would be to minimize shoulder stress in that manner. Mm-hmm. And here's where the psychology overlap really comes in, Les, because it's just so critical for a swimmer to stay focused on this on every single stroke.
Yeah.
And when you're performing a repetitive motion like that, it's so easy to just get into a blur, to just space out, dissociate.
Right.
And that's really the worst thing that you can do if you want to stay on track to change the technique to minimize shoulder stress.
Right. So, it's not just, I guess the first step is helping the athlete understand how their mechanics are maybe contributing to the injury. But that awareness in and of itself, you seem to be suggesting, is insufficient for actually changing the technique or modifying the behavior in practice. Is that right?
Yes, it's exactly right. And in fact, my explanation is really pretty simple and straightforward compared to what the athlete has to do psychologically. That the psychology is really a much bigger issue than the biomechanics.
Yeah. So, like you mentioned association, and I guess I'm wondering what are some things that maybe you do in your role as a biomechanist to help them either relearn the mechanics of their movement or to help them focus in on the change that they need to do so that they're not reverting back to form? Are there things that you do to impact that?
Oh, absolutely. Giving the swimmer specific cues to focus on, specific information for them to see and feel so they can continually check the orientation of their body parts on every arm entry. Because as I said, it's just so easy to space out and in fact, not try to feel the conditioning pain, not try to feel how tired you are.
Yeah.
So swimmers are really fighting that. But they need to stay focused on, and using cues really helps.
Mm-hmm.
To continually check the orientation of the arm as you make that arm entry.
Right. So I think that's a really interesting point, the use of the cues. I guess I wonder, does the use or focus in on specific cues related to the mechanics of their movement, does that in some way interrupt or disrupt the automaticity of the skill? So, I'm thinking of like a high level athlete, an Olympic swimmer, who's, when they're swimming in a race, they probably don't want to be thinking about what they're doing, right? Like I imagine at that level, it just has to become so ingrained that it's automatic. Does the focus on specific cues disrupt that automaticity?
It probably does.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't see how it couldn't to some degree.
Right.
But I do consider that, and usually only give a swimmer one or two cues to focus on, right, so that there's minimal disruption.
Right.
Now, sometimes they'll hesitate, but that's part of the learning process.
Yeah.
They may have to go at a really slow speed. They may have to, and in fact, they'll probably feel like it's very robotic, as opposed to having that automatic feeling.
Yeah. So I imagine, like, in essence, the athlete then is almost relearning the skill so that eventually it becomes more automatic, I guess. Is that the intent?
Right. And this is where there is a considerable time commitment to making that adjustment.
Yeah.
A swimmer has to perform many, many thousands of repetitions at a slow enough stroke rate so they can be sure they're focused in on the technique and making the change.
Yeah.
Because as soon as they fatigue, as soon as they try to go faster, the focus goes out the window.
Yeah, sure. It's harder to focus when fatigued and tired. So I maybe you can talk a little bit more, Rod, about the success or challenges that you have in trying to work with athletes and coaches to, make them aware of how their technique contributes to injury and to modify that technique. Is that a challenging process?
There's two different ways to look at it. When you look at the swimming culture, it's an extremely challenge. It's an extreme challenge, because that's not part of the conventional wisdom. Putting the arm in the water parallel to the surface, that's conventional wisdom. So if we're talking about dealing with the swimming world, it's a huge problem. Yeah. Now, when you look at my situation, the swimmers and coaches that come to me are usually very motivated, very conscientious, and willing to accept the information that I give them and to start using it right away.
Yeah.
So this is where I have an advantage in that segment of the population that seek me out.
Yeah. So I guess the people that are coming to you come with a receptive mindset, and I'm guessing they are aware of your background and your credentials and expertise, and you know, given that you've worked with so many swimmers at such a high level, I imagine that may influence their mindset as well, right? When they know that they're working with someone of your background.
I imagine you probably know that better than I do.
Sure.
Be able to comment on that better.
Oh, well, I mean, definitely in the world of sports psychology, I think for sure that makes a difference, right? If the athlete, you know, comes to you and thinks that you're a competent practitioner, that can frame the whole interaction to begin with, right? And then maybe leads to more receptiveness to suggestions or strategies that are offered for sure, or yeah, just increases their confidence in you. Yeah, maybe you can just talk a little bit more about some of the reasons why shoulder injuries are so common. And obviously, the swimming, you know, swimming involves repetitive motion, but are there specific reasons why shoulder injuries in particular are common in swimming?
Well, you think about how many strokes a swimmer does in a normal workout. Mm-hmm. So regardless of what technique they're using, there's a lot of stress on the shoulder. Yeah. I mean, there's no swimming without shoulder stress. Mm-hmm. So what I seek to do is minimize the shoulder stress. But their shoulders are still going to be stressed no matter how they're swimming. So there's a risk of injury to every swimmer.
Yeah, sure. And are there ways that, like in terms of, you've talked about some aspects in terms of their biomechanics, are there ways in terms of like strengthening or areas that a swimmer can do to mitigate or decrease the likelihood of stress on the shoulder?
Oh, yes, definitely. The three of the strokes, swimmers are using the muscles on the front of the body more than on the back of the body. You know, backstroke, little bit of an exception there, but generally, and swimmers are usually swimming freestyle. The bulk of workouts will usually be freestyle. So swimmers are developing the muscles on the front of the body more than on the back of the body. Mm-hmm. So that pulls those shoulders forward. And sometimes a scapula can be way out of position. You may have seen a swimmer with a scapula, it's either winging or tipping, but they can, that's a sure sign of the muscular imbalance. Mm-hmm. Also the rounded shoulders, that's very, very typical. You see those shoulders pulled forward.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of times that will, when a swimmer does develop a shoulder injury, that is a treatment that they will first try. They will do some strength training to develop the muscles in the back, to pull those shoulders back, pull the shoulder blades together.
Right.
Every swimmer should be doing those exercises before they have a shoulder injury. That would help the situation.
Right. So I guess an effort to minimize these muscle imbalances before injury occurs sounds like it's important in mitigating injury from occurring in the first place.
Right.
And I guess in terms of like age, I'm just thinking, you know, if you can sort of work with swimmers at a younger age, is there benefit to that, you know, before their technique gets developed? Is there an emphasis in your area or with your company on working with younger swimmers maybe who, you know, don't have their technique as ingrained as older swimmers? Or
ideally, I would get a swimmer before they're a teenager, so that they haven't put in excessive training distance,
right?
And made so many repetitions that the habit strength is a real challenge to deal with.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
Sure.
You know, a lot of times, swimmers don't think they need work on their technique, particularly if they're progressing, particularly if they're competing at a high level.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it would only make sense that they would think that their technique is fine.
Yeah.
But then once a swimmer gets to be a teenager, typically the training distance increases, and that compounds the problem. If they have an ineffective technique and with the increase in training distance, it's more likely that an injury will develop.
Right. So what would you suggest, Rod, or I was wondering if in your comment there was the implication that, you know, if an athlete is successful, that maybe they're less likely to pay attention to their technique because they're successful and they think, well, there's, you know, whatever I'm doing is working, right? So why pay attention? Whereas they could be successful and yet still be able to make optimize their technique in a way that would help them sustain their performance or minimize injury. I don't know if that's a correct statement.
Oh, you're right on. Sure. If you're one of the fastest swimmers in the world, why would you think you need to change something?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know? And also, wouldn't you think it was the risk if you did change?
Right.
Even if there's a guarantee that you'll go faster.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have sophisticated analysis procedures now. So it's very easy to show the fastest swimmers in the world that they have technique limitations.
Yeah.
That they can make adjustments, not only to minimize shoulder stress, but also to go faster.
Yeah.
But then there's always that reluctance. You know, why should I change anything when I'm going this fast?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, don't fix it if it's not broken.
Yeah. Right. And you know, what really drives this home too, though, is that because I'm working on an article on shoulder injuries, and well, I'm always working on an article on shoulder injuries. But I went to Swimming World magazine and looked for top swimmers with shoulder problems, and just in like the past 2 or 3 years, there are over a dozen top swimmers who have shoulder problems. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, they've had to have shoulder surgery because of it.
Yeah. And so, again, is your feeling that some of those injuries could be minimized through changes in like either training techniques, reducing muscle imbalances, or in particular, modifying technique?
I would think in almost every case, the combination of those three approaches could very well eliminate shoulder injuries.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as I said, there's just so many repetitions, no matter what you do. You know, it's impossible to avoid shoulder stress completely. And anatomy differs. You know, some individual shoulder may just be a little bit more susceptible to having a problem.
Yeah.
So even a three-pronged approach that addresses all those issues, they can't be a guarantee, but it would certainly greatly minimize the problem.
Yeah. You mentioned, Rod, the sophistication of analytic techniques, and maybe you can, you know, pick a common approach, I guess, that you use, and maybe you can describe what biomechanics analysis involves, or sort of one technique, I guess, that helps the athlete or the coach to see, I guess, what it is that they're actually doing.
Well, underwater video is essential.
Mm-hmm.
Swimmers need underwater video before they're teenagers. You know, that really needs to be a part of their routine from really 9 or 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once a swimmer gets a little bit older, like even a preteen, needs an analysis of how they're generating force throughout the stroke cycle. Mm-hmm. And we have sensors that we can measure that. It's a procedure that is commonly used, but that again needs to be part of a regular routine. Mm-hmm. The underwater video, monthly, a force analysis quarterly, or but on some periodic basis, because that provides the quantitative information. You know, a stroke can look reasonable with video, but until you're measuring the forces, you really don't know where there's a potential for great amount of shoulder stress, or then if we look at it performance-wise, where is the swimmer missing out on generating force mm-hmm. that can make them swim faster.
Right. So for someone unfamiliar with either underwater analysis or force analysis, like maybe you can walk us through, let's say, the underwater video. What would that entail? What would it look like, I guess, in terms of you working with the swimmer and using underwater video to help them improve their stroke?
Well, if we're just using underwater video, the video capture process is pretty quick, mm-hmm. pretty straightforward, and in fact, an entire team could have their video captured in, depending on the size of the group, but half an hour or an hour. Mm-hmm. Then what I usually do is take the swimmers into the classroom for the analysis session,
right,
and point out the limitations. Typically, there are some that typically there are many limitations that are very obvious.
Yeah,
swimmers are putting their arm in a position that they just cannot generate very much propulsion. Mm-hmm. Their arm moves away from the body, yeah, into a much weaker position.
Right. And so when you point out some of these, I guess, deficiencies, for lack of a better word, are the athletes fairly quickly able to make some modifications? I mean, I know earlier we were talking about cues, but are the athletes able to make those modifications fairly rapidly, or is it really sort of an ongoing process, I guess, to implement, like to retain that information and then to implement it in practice?
Well, yes, you're right on with that. It usually, if a swimmer focuses on the cues, they can make the technique change. Mm-hmm. That's usually not the hard part. It's maintaining it. Mm-hmm. That's what's really difficult.
Yeah.
And if you think about what happens in a normal training session, swimmer just doesn't have the opportunity or has so many distractions that it's very, very difficult for them to stay focused under the best of circumstance.
Yeah.
Even if they're motivated to stay focused, there's just so much going on. There's too much of an incentive to swim fast, to race other people, that it's just very easy to lose focus on maintaining the technique.
Yeah, and I guess that's where, you alluded to earlier, Rod, I suppose working or having the benefit of an interdisciplinary approach where maybe you're involving the expertise of biomechanists or physiologists or sports psychology practitioners seems of value. When those changes are implemented, let's assume that the athlete is able to not only modify but sustain the change in their technique or mechanics. What impacts do you see, either in terms of injury reduction or performance, or what I guess from an observational standpoint, or maybe from the scientific data standpoint, do you see changes, or differences in terms of outcomes?
Oh, very big ones. In fact, I've had many clients get back to me, and in their 100-meter time in a given event will drop 4 seconds. That is not unusual. And that might be like after a swim camp or after swimmers working privately with me for a few weeks. They'll go to a swim meet and they'll see a very big performance improvement.
Yeah. And I imagine once they're seeing that performance improvement, that only adds to the motivation to continue, being cognizant of the cues or kind of the changes that they need to maintain. Would that be your observation? Or
and it gets very exciting then too, because usually we see that first big time drop with some technique adjustments that are large adjustments, but then we can get on to some more specific adjustments. That and fine tune that so that we see further time drops.
Does that? I guess there's limits, of course, to human performance. Well, I suppose there's some limits. Do you see those time drops level at a certain point, or is it sort of just continuous drops in times, or at a certain point does that kind of level off a little bit?
We're not really approaching the fastest human swimming. We have a long way to go. There's an example I can give you is with arm coordination. The arm coordination, like in freestyle, that swimmers are normally using, that they normally train with in practice, is a negative index of coordination. There's a way to quantify it. If a swimmer wants to go their fastest, they need to have a positive index of coordination, and considerably positive. And there's 20 years of research that backs this up. It's just such a problem that swimmers are mostly training with a negative index of coordination, but then they want to swim their fastest and they need a positive index of coordination. So this is another huge problem with the culture that we have, that the conventional wisdom is technique based on a negative index of coordination as opposed to a positive index of coordination. Swimmers only get to positive because they start moving their arms so fast, and they just barely go positive. Hope I'm not getting too technical here, but
you're fine. Yeah.
It's easy for me to get on my soapbox about this because this is a concept that is just, to say it's undervalued that doesn't even do justice to it. It's almost unheard of in the swimming culture. And there's a research group in France that has done 20 years of research on it. Their findings are so consistent, and it just clearly shows that swimmers have to use a different technique than what they typically do if they want to go their fastest.
So I guess I'm just thinking, like, when you're reading or involved in that research, I guess, what is it that excites you as a biomechanist? Or I guess really I'm asking kind of what motivates you kind of to get out of bed in the morning and work with swimmers?
Because I see that there's just such incredible potential based on what we know from science. And the swimming culture just hasn't caught up with the science.
So you feel by applying the scientific principles and knowledge from the research that we could be tapping human or swimming potential to a far greater degree than is currently the case. Would that be accurate?
Yes, let me give you some numbers. In the 100-meter freestyle, the world record is just under 47 seconds. If we apply science, such as the arm coordination I was telling you about, such as the force analysis, the science shows that a swimmer could break 40 seconds for 100 meters freestyle. That's 7 seconds faster. And now, that 40 seconds, that's not my idea. Doc Counsilman said this in 1968. He predicted that a human would break 40 seconds. But we're still not anywhere near that. And swimmers are limited because of their technique.
Mm-hmm. So there's clearly, I mean, I imagine, 7 seconds, even without knowing swimming, I'm a former wrestler and I sink like a stone and have absolutely no technique in the swimming pool. But I imagine like 7 seconds is like a quantum leap. Would that be, that sounds like, in a 100-meter run, if you were to, take a couple of seconds off, that would be a huge thing off the world record in the 100 meters dash. It sounds like this would be something equivalent, right? Like
yes.
Off 7 seconds would just be
right.
massive. And also, oh, you're fine. So do you also feel that, again, with kind of coming back to the point about shoulder injuries, that these technical or changes in biomechanics could not only impact speed and performance, but could also, as we've been talking about, reduce injury? Like, is it possible, I guess I'm asking, to simultaneously improve performance and reduce injury risk?
Exactly. The same adjustments that will reduce stress on the shoulder will make you go faster.
Yeah.
I mean, so this is 2 giant reasons to make these changes.
Right. And you mentioned, Rod, that on a number of occasions, I guess, the swimming culture, and I know kind of the athletes you work with or people that are approaching you, sounds like they're quite receptive to your suggestions or your analysis. But are there ways, I guess, to, I don't know, this is maybe more of a broader sociological kind of question, but in your experience, are there ways to address that culture of kind of just higher volume is better, or, just thoughts on how to change maybe the ethos or mindset?
I have been trying to change the culture for about 4 decades. Mm-hmm. And I've been doing a really terrible job. So Les, if you have some ideas, please let me know.
Well, I suppose as we've been learning through recent events with the pandemic, behavior change can be very difficult to encourage. And once people subscribe to certain beliefs, I guess that's a very difficult question, isn't it? I think I'd like to think that certainly through knowledge and education, and obviously in the world of sport, when people see changes in performance, then you would think that then goes a long way than to, maybe making people question some of the conventional wisdom. Not always.
Yes, see, the hard part there is that a lot of times the top performers do so well because they're so big and they're so strong and they're so well conditioned.
Right.
Their technique likely to be average.
Yeah.
And they would have the same limitations of all the people they're racing.
Yeah. Right. They're doing well despite the fact that their technique is not optimal or far from it. But then I guess that, you seem to be suggesting then that sort of, there's a lot of role modeling that goes on, right? So if someone's like big and strong and super fit, then, and they're successful, then I guess others are like, okay, well, they're successful, I'll follow their template.
Right. This is, this is one of the tough things. Sorry. This is one of the tough things, and you can certainly understand that the culture sees these swimmers performing so well. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times they will have very obvious technique limitations. Yeah. I mean, ones that you can see from above the surface.
Right.
But they're going fast. They're winning. They're setting a world record. Yeah. So how bad can that technique limitation be?
Right. Well, and just as you're talking, I was really fortunate to speak with James Gibson in a previous conversation. And I can send you the link to our conversation. But he, seemed to have a very reflective approach and sort of talked about his own injury experience, where he had to have an operation not on his shoulder, but after a difficult workout. And he seems to subscribe, I think, very much to some of the things that you're talking about in terms of the importance of technique and analysis, and not necessarily just thinking that more is always better. So, I don't know if that's reflective of other coaches or if there's still some lag there, but I wanted to ask you too, Rod, just a little bit about, I know you have a lot of expertise in terms of the acceleration of skill learning. And are there some, I guess, tips or strategies that you could offer to coaches, key principles maybe in terms of acceleration of skill learning?
Well, I'm sure you're aware of the guy who's done so much work with this, Anders Ericsson, his deliberate practice concept.
Right.
It's I had the privilege of being able to collaborate with him, and unfortunately he passed away last summer.
Right.
But what he laid out just so concisely, the procedures that what really individuals in any field had to go through to become experts in their field. And it really didn't matter what your field was, what the skill was that you were trying to master. So getting to know Anders has only gotten me to be more appreciative of the components of deliberate practice.
Yeah. What are some, just briefly, what are some key components for people who are not familiar with the concept of deliberate practice?
Well, like one we talked about already, using cues. Mm-hmm. Anders said that the information has to be very understandable. Mm-hmm. Don't want to have miscommunications. So if you're using cues that are very, very specific so that there's no question how a swimmer is going to interpret it, that's going to help to speed up the learning process.
Yeah.
The task difficulty, that's another strategy, that you have to make sure that the task is such that it's at the right level for a swimmer to benefit the most. If the task is too easy, you're just wasting time. If the task is too difficult, they're not going to get it.
Right.
And of course that can vary for, there can be a lot of variation in that in any one group of swimmers. Mm-hmm. So which makes it really, really difficult for a coach.
Yeah. Just going back to injury, and we can focus in on shoulder injury. If an athlete or swimmer is having chronic shoulder issues, how do you assess that they are ready to resume certain levels of activity? Are there certain strategies that you use as a biomechanist to say, okay, well, I think you're ready to get back into the pool and start doing X, Y, and Z?
it has to be gradual. That's if I had to pick one word, that would be it. Because a swimmer returns to training, and you think about the situation they're in. The rest of the team might be swimming 20,000 meters. If they're going to get in and just swim 1,000 meters at a very slow speed, it's going to be very difficult for them. I'm sure I don't have to tell you about the sociology that's going on there.
Yeah.
The teammates aren't going to want to see one of their swimmers, one of their teammates. They're going to think they're getting off really easy. Mm-hmm. But that's just not the case, trying to recover from an injury. And of course, for that swimmer wants to return and get back in the groove and do what everyone else is doing.
Sure.
But it just has to be such a gradual process, because as soon as they increase the training distance, as soon as they increase the speed, the fatigue, they'll be less focused on the technique, and they'll revert back to the best learned technique and continue to injure themselves.
Yeah. How do you reinforce the importance of the gradualness of the progress when, for many athletes, or the athlete mindset is they want something sooner rather than later?
Yeah, you'd be better suited to answer that question than I. I give the swimmers some guidelines, but a lot of times there's only so much they can do when they return to their training situation.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I certainly some discussion or emphasis on how, I guess, quick progressions can be counterproductive. Sometimes can be helpful, but again, I think that is a particular challenge for the athlete, where the mindset is wanting to do more. That education piece seems to be really important in terms of letting them know that, okay, well, maybe doing too much too soon is actually going to hurt you in terms of achieving the goals that you want to be able to accomplish.
Right.
And then I guess if you were to offer some advice along those lines to an injured athlete who is trying to come back, from your standpoint and in your role, what advice would you prescribe to the injured athlete who's coming back or working through a shoulder injury?
Well, every situation is different. Mm. But if a swimmer can train on their own until they're sure they can control the technique, that might be better. Now, in some training situations, maybe they can have their own lane so that they don't have to be distracted. They don't have to try to keep up with other swimmers. That might be a possibility, but that's always a little bit awkward. For one swimmer to be doing something different than what the rest of the team is doing. So they might do better to train on their own until they're positive they can control the technique, and especially start doing it at a speed and fatigue level that they'll be likely to encounter during the workout.
Right. Are there other points that we haven't discussed that you feel are important in terms of prevention of shoulder injuries with swimmers?
Yeah, what's really kind of mind-boggling to me, Les, is that for so many swimmers to be injured over so many years, and for the culture to not change radically, is I just don't get that at all.
Yeah.
And as a psychologist, please tell me how to straighten out the culture, because there's so many wonderful things about swimming, and it would be even better if swimmers could swim their whole careers without having a shoulder injury, without having to deal with those kinds of issues.
Sure. Well, and again, I mean, as you alluded to, I suppose to some extent there's inherent stress put on the shoulder by virtue of the nature of swimming. But I think, as you very clearly pointed out, much of that could be reduced through different means. And whether it's education, whether it's having some discussions like this where people can get information and access to knowledgeable experts such as yourself, whether it's data. I mean, I think in very much in our sporting culture today, I mean, and you know this probably better than I do, 30 or 40 years ago, we didn't really have sports science like we do now, right? Where we can, you can take athletes through underwater video analysis or force analysis. And so, having athletes and coaches get that data that they're already applying to their training and say, okay, well, this also is impacting your likelihood of injury or your ability to come back. And I think when we can put scientific research in front of coaches, but in a digestible way, that seems to be important, right? And sort of translating that knowledge in a manner that they can understand, and that isn't, like, oh, well, that was just a bunch of scientific sort of mumbo jumbo, but I understand what that biomechanist or sports psychologist is saying, I think again also when athletes can see, as you talked about, that there is change, and that even though you are having success maybe using these traditional methods, when you actually modify your technique, you could actually still be improving what you're doing or having the double benefit of minimizing risk. So I think like most things, I suppose culture change is a challenge, but it probably involves multiple efforts, right? It could be on the level of policy. It could be sort of on a more individual level. I think these sort of multi-pronged approaches tend to go a long way. I'm just thinking of, I mentioned the pandemic. Like at one point, seatbelts weren't commonly used. Well, now pretty much everyone does, but there used to be a lot of resistance, or, smoking, right? Where tobacco companies would push back. I think it's commonly accepted now that, if you smoke or are near it, that you're much more likely to get lung cancer. And so, like some of these campaigns, awareness, education, information, a variety of things, but it is a long-term challenge, isn't it?
Well, and if you think about what a swim coach is faced with every time they step on the deck, they probably have a group of 30 swimmers.
Right.
They probably have limited pool time.
Sure.
They may not have an assistant. And just directing traffic that's a big enough challenge.
Yeah.
Then to try to get in meaningful instruction, to work with each swimmer individually, to add a system that's going to get some quantitative information, to take the time to actually go into a classroom, to have a classroom, and then go into a classroom and give them feedback about it, to miss that water time.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of reasons, just when you look at what a coach is faced with, that make it very difficult to implement any of those procedures.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Like clearly not every coach is operating in a high performance environment where they have biomechanists and access to classrooms and facilities and technology. So that certainly I think is a constraint in terms of the behavior change. But also in the world of sports psychology, there's a number of researchers who do coach education, and you're clearly involved in that, given your company and your scientific work. I think when you are, like maybe part of what contributes to culture change is things like certification programs, right? So it's like, I imagine there's a lot of parents that maybe they, okay, the mom or dad that was a swimmer at one point ends up coaching the team. Well, in some countries or cultures, they want to make sure that the coaches have a certain level of competence or knowledge. And so, maybe there's people going out into the community who have expertise, who are giving coach education clinics or those kinds of things. So I guess maybe the knowledge sort of spreads out beyond just people at the highest level of performance. But yeah, I guess some of these cultural changes certainly can take time, but there are examples of it, I suppose, as I alluded to, in other health behaviors or domains outside of sport. But yeah, it's great to have the chance to speak to you, Rod, and it's wonderful to get the benefit of all of your wealth of expertise and knowledge. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure.